everyone, this is Jacqueline Cooper with CryptoMom2 Talk Show and the Blockchain Legal Institute. And I'd like to thank everyone for hopping on and ask that you like and subscribe because there are a lot of conversations that are coming down the pike. And I want to make sure that you are always in the know of what's going on in our evolving community. So today I actually have been referred over to this wonderful woman by a few different sources because of a book that I'm writing, The Bitcoin Cinderella and the True Stories of Women in Bitcoin. But she has done a lot in this space. So I'm excited to be talking with her, both for the book as well as for sharing out. So that way, if you find that you would like to click into her link and follow her talk shows, you can do that as well. Everything will be embedded below. And so if you are driving, don't have paper and pen, don't worry. I will just come back to this episode and you'll be able to follow her and enjoy all of her conversations as well. So Amber, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, sure. So I want to find out more about your background for the book, but also for everyone else who's listening. So why don't we start talking about your background first, and then we're going to hop on over to Bitcoin and what your first experience was with it when you first learned about it. What are you currently doing? Tell us a little bit more about that.
What am I not currently doing is probably the better question. And that's a common theme, I think, in Web3 as a whole. So currently, I am the host of HackHERZ podcasts, which we'll talk about more. Thank you. I put a lot of thought into that. I really wanted it to convey something, but also be a play on words into the technology that we utilize. And then I also am a recent founder of a consulting company that focuses on CFO, COO, and controller services. Been doing it for almost 2 decades. So I started my journey very roundabout and weird. I went to school right out of high school for pre-med. I was going to be an anesthesiologist. Went and got a degree in biology, which I do nothing with. I was a medic in the Army. And then through a series of unfortunate events, as Lemony Snicket would say, I decided that wasn't the path for me and did a little more traditional route. Well, maybe not so much these days, but at a young age, got married, had a child, got divorced, and then was just dealing with life. And as a single parent, I decided to go back to school and to pursue something else. And I was really fortunate, probably my first experience ever with a mentor and somebody advising me in a better direction. I had an advisor at the time. I was, like to age myself a little bit, it was really common to major in just business.
Yeah.
And she was a former CPA and said, don't do just business. You need to do accounting. It's like business on steroids. And I was like, okay. So I switched to accounting, but then I was like, but I really like tech. And in my opinion at that time, and this was like 20 years ago, FinTech didn't exist as far as like a traditional college path or a university path. There weren't degrees geared that way. And so I asked the school I was at, it was a small private college, and I was like, can I do 2 majors at a time? Is that allowed? And they're like, well, we don't usually recommend it, but you've got good grades, so sure, we'll let you try it. So I double majored. I did computer science, focused on coding, and then accounting with the intent of sitting for my CPA. And then I spent a handful of years right out of school in public accounting as an auditor, which was invaluable because it was a very different perception. And it also taught me that I don't want to be a public accountant. And then I came to the corporate world and really dived into FinTech. And at my largest role, I was overseeing a team of 50 plus globally for Lenovo, which is a $56 billion company.
Yeah.
I was seated like 2 or 3 seats under the CFO, so fairly high up, and gained a ton of knowledge and experience in FinTech specifically. And then made the leap not long after that into the Web3 space. It captured my heart. And I think once you dabble in this area, if you are inquisitive, you will probably never go back to anything else. It just won't live up to things.
So how did you learn about Bitcoin? When in your journey did you discover that, or who introduced you to Bitcoin?
So my now husband, who I've been with for a decade, when we met, he has a tech background as well. and a fully tech background, marketing and tech. So kind of the different flip side of things. And he was on the infrastructure side of tech. And so he was around back in very beginning of time, when it was like no one knew about it, right? Like, unless you happen to be one of the lucky few who read Satoshi's paper, you did not know what anyone was talking about, the dark ages. And he actually mined it. He was one of the very first people to mine it, and he had a lot of it and sold it for like next to nothing.
Oh no.
So I told him he's lucky he still has me, because we would be ultra mega rich people right now if he had just held. So that was kind of my first introduction. It piqued my interest. I started to look into it more because I only knew like the HTML5 side of coding, right? Like kind of the fun website-y type coding, because I'm creative at heart, which I know sounds like an oxymoron because I'm an accountant, but I very much have a creative side, and it was kind of like how I expressed it. And this intrigued me because if it's got a very black and white nature, and I loved that.
So did you ever kind of look into the open source coding of the Bitcoin protocol and try to understand it?
I would love to be able to say that I was one of those people that did earlier on, but I would be absolutely full of it and a liar if I said that I had that forethought. At the time, I was young. I was basically a single parent. I mean, we hadn't gotten married yet. He was a single parent. There was just so much. It was like survival mode at that moment. So it took me a little while to warm up to a point where I felt enough security to look at something that was deemed so risky.
So, what are your thoughts in terms of how Bitcoin can help different communities, whether it's individuals that are unbanked, or different countries, or women?
Sure.
Because I know you've seen a lot because of your travels around the world.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, and I know this is definitely an area of contention, right? Bitcoin versus blockchain. Like, it's always the discussion. If you go to a Bitcoin specific conference, the maximalists will be like, there is nothing else. It's Bitcoin and everything else is a scam. There's some pretty strong opinions there. And I think, like, for me, my opinion, having witnessed it in real time, both where it exists and where it's attempting to be existing, is that adoption is going to look different everywhere.
Right.
You know, if you go and you look at countries like Venezuela, where hyperinflation exists of their actual fiat currency, and the stabilization of cryptocurrency, not necessarily Bitcoin, but just crypto as a whole, is far more stable than their fiat. And there's a pathway there for them to do business and to exist. That's going to look very different for them. It's a necessity, and the adoption is going to be easier, in my opinion, because of it's a need, versus somewhere like maybe areas of Europe or the EU and the Americas, where we're more ahead of the game or developed in certain areas. Then you're going to see a lot more adoption based around desire and want, because of there is more disposable income. Not to say that that's the case across the board, but I think, you know, like looking at the different modes of transportation to get it to the masses, I think the key is it's not going to look the same everywhere, and it's not the answer everywhere. I actually just got back last night from Cuba, from the country of Cuba.
Yeah.
And I had went down there to talk to, for my podcast, an individual. I only knew a limited amount about the country because it's obviously a very closed off communist country. And with the US, we have a lot of embargoes, and it's really hard to know the truth from, you know, the narrated story.
Yeah. What'd you find?
Yeah. And it was probably the most humbling, enlightening experience I've ever had in all of the countries I've visited. Not only was it the safest country I've ever been to, which most Americans in the US don't think is the case, but the people there live at a level of poverty that most of us can't wrap our heads around, and yet they're completely generous, willing to offer you anything to make your day better, happy, and making the most of it. But what really blew my mind related to the tech, and this is the piece like that I went to really investigate, was the person I originally wanted to speak to couldn't get into the city. There's a whole slew of reasons why related to funding that I'm going to talk about in like my podcast episodes with them. So come find it because it's really
Yeah.
fascinating. But um, by happenstance, my husband went with me and we took a historic walking tour of Old Havana because we wanted intentionally to stay where the people lived. I didn't want to be in the like quote unquote government tourist areas, not only because we're not supposed to as American citizens, but also I wanted to know what it was really like there. And during this walking tour, one of the things we found was the young man that gave us the tour actually has a job part-time for a US tech company. And he actually informed us of a lot that we didn't know. For instance, the entire country of Cuba only had access and gained access to internet 5 years ago,
I
which
don't doubt
is,
that. I really don't
is
doubt.
insane. I mean, when you think about how much we utilize the internet and utilize being able to have Wi-Fi, and because of the government's control over things, anytime that they don't like what's going on, they will just shut it off
No,
on a whim.
I'm gonna interrupt for a second. 5 years
Yeah,
ago, put for everyone who's listening, put that in perspective. We were in COVID in 2020.
yeah.
So 3 years ago, so right before COVID, they started getting access to the internet. Can you imagine if they didn't have access to the internet during that time period, how cut off? I mean, they still were cut off, but
Well, and this is a country whose literally their only source of any economy really is geared towards tourism, right? Like it's not necessarily US tourism because of the embargoes. There's a limited amount during prior administrations. They had opened it up some, but then that got shut back down and then COVID occurred. So essentially, every means of funds for these families evaporated when COVID occurred. And on top of that, from a technology space, they don't have consistent access. So not everywhere has it. There's definitely areas there where the only means they have is a little SIM card and a phone, and it's splotchy. I'm like the only access we had was that way, and it was like dial up. To really throw you back, I swear I heard AOL in my ears when we were waiting for the news to load. I mean, it was slow. And it's not consistent. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
yeah.
So I mean, like it's very much like going back in time, and it complicates what's already a complicated situation. Yet
So
there are people there working on bringing them up to speed on Web3, which blows my mind.
So what about cryptocurrency? What about Bitcoin? What about anything other than business use applications on blockchain and Web3? What
Well,
did you?
and see, this is where I think that we're going to see adoption happen in unique and life-changing ways for countries such as that. The government's not going to be okay with that there, obviously, because of the control measures they have in place around everything else. The beauty of blockchain, of Bitcoin, of cryptocurrency, of all of this technology is that they can utilize the VPNs that the government can't necessarily always shut off and on,
Got it.
and kind of do it like they do everything else, which it sounds very like dark and mysterious. Everything's a black market there, whether it's exchanging currency or buying some eggs from your neighbor out of their front window, which I kid you not is really what happens. It is how life occurs. And so it's very much this real-time bartering system based on need and what they have. And I think that there is a huge opportunity there, and they are thirsty for it. There are people there who are actively catching up at lightning speed, no pun intended, in the Bitcoin world,
Yes.
to the technology that we've had other places, not just in America, obviously, in all of the regions for a lot longer. So I think there's going to be some pretty massive things to come out of that. If nothing else, some really interesting human case studies on application.
So what interested you in the person that you were going down there to interview?
So I originally, it's actually kind of a funny story. So my husband's always had it on his bucket list to go to Cuba. We
Yeah.
are both water babies. We love to snorkel and scuba dive, and there are very few places in the world that the underwater ecosystems aren't in the process of being spoiled by humankind,
Yeah.
whether it's from rising temperatures or chemicals or whatnot. And Cuba is one of the places that still has a lot of unspoiled land and a lot of unspoiled nature in a time that's, 50 plus years behind the rest of the world. And so we also knew there was a need there, and that if you have a means of transferring and going into the country, you can actually do a lot of good with very little.
Mhm.
So the original plan was, how can I make this a legal trip, right? Because if you can't just say, I want to go there, it's illegal to go as an American, as a US citizen for tourism. However, there are means of going there that are completely legal that you can still very much do that and be very helpful. The most common way that I recommend people look into it is a visa called for the benefit of the Cuban people, which is essentially tourism. It's just a different way of going about it. I went on a journalism visa. So when I knew that the trip was going to happen and I had guaranteed that it could happen, I started reaching out to the community of women and people in the network that I knew and said, does anybody just by happenstance know anybody that exists in this country working in tech? Because I know that this is kind of like the black hole in the Caribbean compared to the rest of us. And I would be curious to see where things are at and have a conversation. I think it would be really fascinating and it might be helpful.
Mhm.
And so that's how it got started. An introduction was made.
Awesome. That is awesome. Okay, I'm going to wrap it back to Bitcoin. So when did you buy, and this is not investment advice, not, it's not legal advice, it's just education and opinion. When did you purchase your first Bitcoin, and did you know how to navigate wallets?
Oh, Lord, no. It is for the most part, right? Like you have to have a doctorate basically to navigate the lefts and rights and how to understand what's happening. However, there are a lot of companies now that are making it a lot easier.
Yeah.
I definitely was working adjacent to the space far longer than when, like, I started far sooner in that regard than when I was comfortable enough to leap into actually purchasing any crypto of my own. Now I'm neck deep, as we all end up in a variety of ways. And now it's more about like, how do I ensure the continuity if something were to happen to me, the security of wallets, and what does that look like? And it's something that actually weighs on my mind a lot, is the on and off ramp scenario, because I think like there's going to be a massive improvement in the adoption speed when we figure that out a little better, right? Because of I'm a millennial, but I am literally the first year of it, so I'm kind of also a Gen X. And like backwards from that age, when I talk to my mom, who's in her late 60s, she's super interested. She wants to understand the technology. But these are a generation of people that, they didn't grow up with computers at their fingertips. I didn't even grow up with computers at my fingertips. My first computer wasn't even in my house until I was like a junior in high school. And at school, we only had like one or two in the school for most of my education. So we have to be able to on-ramp these individuals and adopt them in a way that's completely different than the younger generations, who are more intuitive because that's just part of their dialogue. And so that's something I think about a lot, right? Like how complicated it was for me, who has a degree based in tech, who has an accounting degree. Like these pieces should make it fairly simple, and it wasn't. So I'm intrigued by the on and off ramp scenario and what that looks like and how we can make it easier, and what the overall adoption abilities are there and use cases, because I think the use cases are endless.
I agree with you, and I'm going to add another layer only because of my law hat and also being a single mom too. I'm always concerned that, and for anyone who's listening, reach out to me, because there are very affordable ways to do this, even though I'm not giving legal advice. Everyone needs a will. And if you have digital assets, you especially need a will. And your family needs to know where your seed words are and how to access your wallets, because even though everyone says keep it secret, if something happens to you, then it ends up that they don't know and it stays on the blockchain. So
It's just the time. And there are situations. I've actually recently spoke to the founder of Webacy, Maiko Isagawa, and that was one of her reasons that she founded her company, is she had a loved one who passed away that was fairly young. They had wallets, they had digital assets, and no one knew how to access them. And so like when you're thinking about, I mean, like I agree with you completely. Again, no advice given here, but like that's how generational wealth is built. It's not built on getting rich now. It's really built on like thinking about how you are perpetuating it to the future generations, what you're doing to set up passive income and additional routes into security on a longer basis. And if you're not considering your digital assets, you're crazy, because they count. And they're only
Yeah.
going to count more with time.
Well, you know that they count when the IRS starts changing the code and starts asking, have you invested in Bitcoin and digital assets? So, again, for everyone who's listening, it's your own personal choice, but you really do have to declare everything. Again, when I say personal choice, you will be not following the laws if you don't declare, but you have to have a good accountant, as you know, to know what is a taxable event and what's not a taxable event. But
well, and there's a lot of misinformation, and that's I think something too that people need to be aware of is more and more companies are realizing the value of getting involved in like the crypto accounting game or the crypto tax game, but most of them don't have one iota of a clue what they're doing, and they think they can just go read the code. Like anybody in the US specific to US tax code could tell you it's not that simple, or everybody would do their own taxes. We have one of the most complex tax codes in the world, if not the most complex. And on top of that, half of the regulation's not concrete yet. It's fluid, which means you need somebody that not only understands the technology and how it applies to your specific situation or your specific company, if you're a founder, but you also need somebody who can interpret all of that, just like a lawyer interprets contracts or whatever else. Yeah, it's written in plain letters, but that doesn't always mean it makes sense.
right. There are definitely a lot of layers. Definitely a lot of layers. So going back to your experience in the FinTech world, have you seen the companies are looking at Bitcoin or Bitcoin crypto, a combination? What have you seen over the years in terms of how not just individuals, but businesses have adopted it?
It's definitely a mix, unless it's a company specifically dedicated to one chain or one currency. It's almost always a mix, which is interesting. I mean, when you think about it, right? Like, because if it's a US company, 99% of a basic normal fiat-based US company is just doing business in US dollars. Right. Unless they're a big conglomerate. So you have to think about the fact that most of these companies, while they may be a US company or they might be a company based out of the Grand Cayman or wherever, right, French, whatever, they're doing business on a global scale almost all of the time, both at their team level and their contractors and team members they employ, as well as the clientele or the customer or whatever their end product is. So it tends to be a pretty wide mix, even on companies that you wouldn't expect it to be, right? Like a mining company. So if you have a mining company, you think, well, they're pretty single threaded, they're doing one thing. Not typically. Like any good business, most companies, even ones that seem very specific, will have multiple verticals of revenue. And that's just good business.
Yeah, no, diversification is always a good thing to think about. And that's true in anything that you're doing. So you're consulting. What are you consulting in?
So because of my experience has been FinTech for so long, prior to starting my own company, one of the things that I did was I was a partner at a financial group who did not have a sector for Web3. And when I went on there and became a director or partner there, I was like, why are we leaving this opportunity on the table? And there's a lot of fear and miscommunication and miseducation, just general lack of knowledge around Web3. And they gave me the green light to build it out. And so when I left, I had built it in under a year from 0 to almost 40 plus clients. And what I found is there is a massive need in Web3 for access to someone who has knowledge about finances, right? Who either can act as like a fractional CFO, so someone that can give advice like a CFO, or even to some extent a COO, and do like controller services, which is like making sure their books are correct for month end, helping give guidance to make sure that they're utilizing the right tech stack for all of the things that go into running a business. Because at the end of the day, founders are brilliant. They have an idea. That's how they became a founder. but that doesn't mean that they need to be brilliant at every piece of the business. The smartest founders, the people that have successful companies, are the ones who realize how to leverage other individuals for the areas that they aren't strong in.
Yeah.
And that's where I come in. I help fill those gaps.
So for everyone who's listening, I definitely will have Amber's contact information, so that way you can reach out to her. And tied to some of the things that we've also mentioned, I would suggest that you also look at the Blockchain Legal Institute, because it has content about every possible topic you could think of, in addition to the laws from around the world and the laws here in the States, for both lawyers, accountants, as well as individuals who are navigating this space. Any last minute thoughts, Amber, that you can think of that for our listeners that would guide them on their journey within this blockchain space?
Absolutely. It's never too soon and it's never too late to ask a question.
Yeah.
If you are curious about something, you belong here. If you want to meet people and you want to learn, you belong here. If you feel like you don't belong here, you belong here. And that's the beautiful thing. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about, I think, Web3 as a whole is, I like to say, I don't fit in a box, I blow the box up.
I love it.
And I think that's like the true nature of this space is, we're so early still in the development with this impressive tech that anything that you are good at, you can literally come into the space and find a way to create a role and create a future for what you want to do. Had you told me 10 years ago I would be doing this, I would have thought you were off your rocker. And now I feel like I'm fulfilling my life's purpose. And it's just, to me, proof positive that if I can do it, anybody can.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. I really appreciate you hopping on. And I know that we're going to see each other both in real life as well as on other Twitter spaces and other, online platforms. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
So,
thanks for having me.
yeah. So as I always say to everyone at the end of the show, be kind to yourself, be kind to others. We're so interconnected. We're all part of one world, and now more than ever. Everyone, have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you. Bye.